Hello YouTube, 'tis I, Root-1, and this is a video with Kerbal Space Program. And essentially the reason I'm doing this is because I discovered a Reddit/Discord where there's a weekly or so Kerbal Space Program challenge. This is challenge number 23, and essentially what the challenge is to put a surface base, which you can see me constructing right now, on Duna, and then to have a separate mission, take a lander down to the surface, swap out the crew, and then ascend back up to the interplanetary stage, go to the moon, Ike, and then go back home, essentially. That's the idea. So now there was an easy, medium, and hard level of this challenge, and the easy was to go to Mun and Minmus. The medium, which I chose, was to go to Duna and Ike, and the hard was to go to Eve and Gilly. Now, I sort of thought that Eve was a little bit too difficult for my skill level, but then Duna was also a little bit too easy. So I decided to set the arbitrary challenge for myself to land the surface base and lander at the poles of Duna. And I believe I chose the North Pole. So that sort of creates a little bit of a difficulty and issues with sort of inclination and whatever. But yeah, enough rambling about that. You can sort of see me constructing the interplanetary stage here. And yeah, it's fairly basic. It really doesn't need that much delta V because I'm not returning back to Kerbin. With this, I'm sort of just dumping it into the atmosphere. And I also way over budgeted the amount of delta V I need for this. I ended up detaching that interplanetary stage still with like 2,000 meters per second delta V or something stupid like that. Yeah, so right here you can see me constructing the first stage with a few aerospikes, and that's sort of just because I've had this little bit of an obsession with aerospikes recently, how they're both vacuum and sea level optimized, but after discovering their abysmal TWR, I decided to go with a more conventional sea level optimized engine. Here you can see me just getting a proper Duna transfer window with Kerbal alarm clock, and yeah, it was pretty far away, and it was also at night, so unfortunately you can't see it too well, but my ascent, as you can see, sort of just standard, tipping over sort of the regular speed, detaching those side boosters when they were done. You've got a pretty tall fairing there, and, that's sort of unavoidable, but, it's still pretty cool looking. And you can see me just pushing my apoapsis outside of the atmosphere, and then just making a maneuver node for circularization. And I actually brought a lot more delta V than I actually needed, both on the second stage, which was a Rhino stage, and this first stage. I sort of started a little bit with that first stage before draining it completely, detaching it, and then starting up the Rhino stage. And after using the Rhino stage for a little bit, I completed my circularization with it, and I still had a significant of delta V left. So after making a maneuver node to exit Kerbin's sphere of influence and put myself sort of on an approximate Duna encounter, sort of close enough, then I sort of had to time warp around a few times because there was a bit of an unfortunate Mun encounter that I was trying to avoid. So here you can see me just ejecting from Kerbin's sphere of influence. So just finishing off that Rhino stage right there, and then firing up the 4 nuclear engines on the interplanetary upper stage. I think the fact that I had a lot of extra fuel left in the Rhino stage is sort of the main reason that I had a stupid amount of delta V left in that interplanetary stage. Like I said before, something like 2,000 meters per second delta V. So now you can see me just time warping out of Kerbin's sphere of influence and sort of getting ready to make a quick interplanetary adjustment burn in order to get a very, very nice polar encounter with Duna. Since I'm putting my base at the pole, it was sort of a little bit tricky. I'm not 100% sure why a few things that happened. If I can speech a little bit better. So here you can see me just sort of bringing that orbital line sort of approximately right above it, but for some reason I couldn't exactly get that to stay where it was, and I had to do a few adjustment burns across the interplanetary sort of travel a little bit. So here you can see me just time warping up to that maneuver node, and I time warped past it. That's probably why it didn't work too well, and why I was left with a little bit of that. But I sort of just decided that I didn't need another maneuver node, and decided to sort of just move it around using the regular, just pointing on the nav ball, essentially. And you can see I sort of overshot a few times, but I decided that it was pretty much fine. I don't know if this is a glitch with Kerbal Space Program here, but I've found that if you make your circularization burn before you actually enter the sphere of influence of the target, then it sort of offsets your orbit or your maneuver node a little bit, and I've got absolutely no idea why it does that. So yeah, as you can see, I'm sort of just finishing off the interplanetary course correction a little bit, just so that it's a perfect orbit, essentially. And now you can see me here entering Duna's sphere of influence and creating a retrograde burn maneuver node in order to get circularized around Duna in a very polar orbit. And you can just see me readjusting the thrust limiter, so I can have a bit of a higher TWR than I was using for my interplanetary course correction. So this was sort of my first mission to the polar part of any planet except Kerbin, really. So I found it a little bit weird how quickly the view was moving from left to right, because you normally only get one rotation of that per orbit in an equatorial, but it's concentrated around the poles when you do it like that. So I was trying to speed it up a little bit and go up to 4 times physical time warp, but as you can see, the Kraken did not like that at all, so I had to bring it down again. And now you can see that that sort of messed up my orbit a little bit, and it was a little bit elliptical. So you can see me just, that may have looked like an explosion, but that's just because I used separatrons instead of decouplers on that stage, just to get rid of it, and I'm not 100% sure why. But yeah, here you can see me just making a maneuver node to get onto sort of the right place that I sort of want to land it. I wanted to land it a little bit on the light side of Duna so that I could sort of see what I was doing. So I did a bit of a normal burn there as well. Like I said, I do have a lot of delta V on this craft. So in order to land the actual base itself on Duna, I have 3 aerospike engines attached to 3 points on that base, which was really, really tricky to get the center of thrust right. And then I also have an enormous amount of parachutes on those. And as you'll see, after I land, I detach those 3 aerospikes just by fully throttling them up and then detaching them using the radial decouplers. So here you can see me just descending through the atmosphere a little bit, waiting until I get sort of into the thicker parts of the atmosphere. And as you can see, the base sort of reoriented itself a little bit just due to atmospheric drag. Duna has a very, very weird atmosphere. It's thin enough that you don't really get re-entry heating issues, and parachutes aren't that effective. I mean, they are quite effective, but you have to have a lot of them, as you can see them deploying right there. And air-breathing engines don't work. So it's sort of a really bad atmosphere, and you also don't really, you get enough drag that it sort of messes up your ascent as you go with like a normal lander. So here you can just see me firing up those aerospikes and landing, and right now you can see me, yeah, just, I went up a little bit too high before I detached those side boosters, if you can call them that, or whatever. But now you can see me just showcasing the base a little bit and taking all 3 Kerbals out. I believe I brought Bill, Bob, and Jeb. So yeah, just the 3 classic Kerbals, so that I could switch them out for the new landing crew when they came here, and bring Bill, Bob, and Jeb just back to the Kerbal Space Center in preparation for their next thing. So yes, I've got the 3 Kerbals lined up there in front of the base with the flag. Looks pretty cool. Just gonna pop them into their respective places. So the scientist in the science lab, the pilot in the command module, and the engineer down in that landing can, or hitchhiker's can, I think it's called. I'm not 100% sure what it's called. But here you can now see me designing the next lander that will land both on Duna to swap out the crew and land on Ike as well before returning back to Kerbin. So here it's sort of basic. Again, I used aerospikes because of my aerospike obsession. They're efficient down at Duna sea level, even though vacuum optimized engines would have worked just as well. But yeah, they're efficient down at sea level and up in the vacuum of space. So in order to get the rover, which is also a requirement of the challenge, I don't think I actually mentioned that, but the rover is a requirement. I sort of had a pre-built rover before that I built for a mission to Elu, I believe, at one point, and I was very, very happy with that rover. So I decided I could just reuse it, and in order to detach it, once I reached there, I sort of just added a decoupler at the very bottom of the rover, and you can see me attaching it right now. And there wasn't sort of enough space to land without detaching it, so the way I sort of landed it was I sort of hovered above Duna for a split second and then dropped it. And then it would sort of bounce away a little bit, and then I could land the lander sort of out of the way of the rover. So now you can see me just attaching it there to the interplanetary stage. And the interplanetary stage is going to be fairly standard. Just, 4 nuclear engines you can see me inserting right there. And then just some Mark 1 liquid fuel fuselages, and then just some reaction wheels and some nose cones and batteries. The nose cones aren't actually necessary, but, makes it look better. Then just after that, I'm now constructing the stage that will complete my Kerbin orbital circularization, and that's just going to be a Rhino stage. And that you can see me constructing right there. I actually calculated the delta V requirements incredibly well on this mission. I sort of run out of delta V exactly as I'm finishing my Kerbin circularization, so that was pretty great. And you can just see me sort of constructing the lower stage now with just 2 side boosters with those fuel lines that sort of feed into the center core, so that when I detach those side boosters, the center stage is still fully fueled. And that way it's significantly more efficient. And I actually had to redo this launch 1 or 2 times because those side cores actually ended up hitting the center one, and that caused some problems. So here you can just see me just doing a fairly standard launch, just sort of tipping over once I hit 100 meters per second, and sort of being at 45 degrees by the time I hit 10 kilometers up. You can see the side core detaching, or the side boosters detaching right there. And you can see me sort of just slowly pushing my apoapsis out of the atmosphere and up to around the 80 kilometer mark. And after that, I go ahead and create a maneuver node just to do a standard circularization, deploy the fairing, and then just time warp up to that maneuver node and go ahead and execute that burn. I didn't actually need to have that first stage still attached because, as you can see, it was sort of just 50 meters per second delta V, but I just like to drain my fuel tanks entirely. And as you can see there, I have completed my circularization, and now I'm just making a maneuver node for my escape from Kerbin and ascent sort of near Duna's orbital height. And you can see I sort of got an encounter really lucky there right away. But I don't think that held because I didn't execute this burn that you can see going on perfectly. So you can see I sort of just had that Rhino stage give a tiny little kick, same as the first stage, sort of give, 50 or 100 meters per second delta V, and then the nuclear engines complete the rest of the ejection. And after faffing about a little bit just with interplanetary correction burns, you can see I've sort of gotten a very nice polar encounter with Duna right there. So you can see me, I've already time warped into Duna's sphere of influence, and you can see me creating my circularization maneuver node right there. And as I come in, I just execute that burn. I'm not 100% sure what the issue was here, but there was a little bit of a Kraken attack, and I think that might have been it. So it sort of offset my orbital heights a little bit. So my apoapsis was a little high, my periapsis was a little low. So now it was just a matter of time warping so that the base was pretty much directly underneath the craft, and then, or not directly underneath, but sort of in the same orbital sort of line of sorts. So yeah, now you can see me just transferring all the crew over to that lander and then going ahead and detaching that lander from the interplanetary stage and then going ahead and getting ready to go suborbital or to execute my burn so I can descend into Duna's atmosphere and sort of down to the base. I had to do this descent quite a few times. I cut them all out because, I'm not going to showcase my failure. But yeah, I sort of just had to muck around with the maneuver nodes a little bit, sort of just to get my landing right around the base. And I got within around 300 meters, which was pretty good. Especially considering Duna has that atmosphere and the drag, you can't sort of perfectly see where you're going to land. So you can sort of just... I got a little bit of re-entry, but not even a single temperature gauge showed up, so it wasn't a problem. You can see the drogue chutes deploying there, and then the main chutes with a little bit of lag, and it was sort of around this point that I started getting a lot of lag. And you can see me deploying that rover there just a little bit, and it sort of bounces away, ready for the lander to go. So now I'm just going to move and switch all the crew using that rover. And as I was saying, the lag was sort of here, so I actually sped up the footage after this first one here to around 20 times normal speed, just to transfer all the crew. And I'm pretty sure that was just due to the fact that, I'm on a surface of a planet, so there's sort of a lot of graphical rendering going on, especially considering there's also an atmosphere, and there's also 3 craft within physics range. There's the base, the rover, and the lander, so I think that contributed to it a lot as well. So yeah, just transferring all the crew here, Bob, Bill, and Jebediah, moving back to the lander, and the other Kerbals, I don't remember what they were called, just being transferred over to the base. So in this save file, it's a science save file, and I've got pretty much the entire tech tree unlocked. I think the only thing I'm really missing is the rapiers, so I didn't really do any science on this mission. And as you can see, I'm completing all the transfers of the Kerbals there, and now I'm sort of just getting ready to ascend from Duna. And you can see me doing that right here, just launching up those 2 arrow spikes, and I didn't have to bring the rover back or anything, so I just pushed my orbital height fairly steeply up to around that of the interplanetary craft, and I didn't really get that good of an ascent. I'm not the best at making this work too well, and I also didn't have a perfectly polar orbit with the interplanetary stage, so that sort of contributed to it a lot. And the reason I did such a steep ascent is because I pretty much have an outrageous amount of delta V on this lander, and I just don't like dealing with atmospheres, so, that's sort of the main reason. And you can see me just sort of pushing my intersect closer and closer together there, doing just a standard Laum lazy method of rendezvous and docking, where you just kill velocity relative to the target, and then point towards the target and do a quick burn, and then just rinse and repeat until you've got a very, very close separation like you can see I have here. And I think in the end I sort of had a few 100 meters of just stuff that I was just sort of, trimming off slowly by slowly. And I also realized that I couldn't actually control the interplanetary stage because I didn't leave any Kerbals on it. Therefore, I actually had to get Jebediah to go out and sort of fly over to the interplanetary stage so he can control it and have the 2 craft maintain alignment as I docked. So like I said, I didn't do anything fancy. I didn't bring any RCS or anything to do docking. So I sort of just had the 2 craft maintain alignment whilst they got closer and closer together, as you can see there, and docking was fairly easy. So then I went ahead and shut down those toroidal aerospike engines so that I could use just the nuclear engines to get out to Ike. So now the way I did this to get an equatorial encounter with Ike is that I got a cheeky little encounter with Ike in the sort of the first orbit there, and that was sort of just to adjust my Duna orbit to be eccentric but very very equatorial, and then that way I could sort of just do a mid-course correction burn on the second orbit, so that I could get a nice equatorial encounter with Ike. This did take a little bit longer than what is showcased on screen. It was sort of just a lot of faffing about with the little maneuver nodes, but in the end I sort of made it work. And as you can see, I'm extending my polar orbit way out to Ike, and you can see as it comes into the Ike sphere of influence, it sort of gets adjusted to be a little bit more equatorial, but also intersecting Duna's surface, which is not ideal, so I sort of just made another little maneuver node up at apoapsis just to raise my periapsis up above the atmospheric line of Duna. You can see me just getting that quick little gravity assist there so that I can change my inclination very, very cheaply, and you can sort of now just see me adjusting my periapsis up above the atmospheric line. And now that that's done, I can sort of just exit the sphere of influence and of Ike, and then see where my next Ike encounter is, and then make a maneuver node there so that I can get a very nice, close, low equatorial orbit with Ike. So you can just see me executing that correction burn there. It was very, very cheap, just 4 meters per second delta V. And then I time warp just into the sphere of influence, create a maneuver node to circularize, and then execute that burn so that I'm circularized at Ike, and then from there I can just deploy the lander. I tend to overestimate the amount of delta V I need, or overestimate the amount I have as well, because I sort of always forget to account for the fact that I'm going to be detaching landers on the return trip, and detaching rovers from the landers and everything, so I often am just detaching, like, 2,000 or 1,000 meters per second delta V on Kerbal entry, or that lander will still have, 500 or so meters per second delta V after this mission. So I'm not the best at estimating these sorts of things, but I've sort of just rambled over the detachment of the lander there. So now that that's done, I'm just time warping down to a maneuver node where I'm going to lower my orbit so that I'm on a suborbital trajectory. And I didn't really aim for anything specific. I sort of just got it down somewhere into the light side of Ike. So you can just see me time warping down to a reasonable point. And since I have such a high TWR, I can basically just sort of mess around. I didn't even really do a suicide burn because I have so much delta V on this craft. And that was a fairly good docking. It was a little bit of a bounce, but I'm also on a bit of a slope here, so, it's reasonable. The EVA packs work a lot better here on Ike, so that's always a great thing. You can just see me planting the flag, taking a surface sample or whatever. It's not really that important, because like I said, I've pretty much finished the entire tech tree, and I didn't really spend much time on the surface. I sort of just went and took off immediately once I had, brought everyone, or not everyone, but brought somebody out to plant a flag. So now that that was done, I sort of just raised my apoapsis up to around the interplanetary stage again. It wasn't particularly equatorial, the interplanetary stage, so there was, again, a bit of a discrepancy in the inclinations. But since I have, again, an outrageous amount of delta V, it didn't really matter. I could just, brute force and intersect, and then kill velocity relative to the target. So you can just see me doing that there, adjusting my inclination, and from there it was sort of just a matter of catching up with the interplanetary stage. So just lowering my orbital height just a little bit so that on each orbit it would sort of get me closer and closer to that interplanetary stage. And in the end, as you can see, I got a pretty close intersect, and just with a quick maneuver node, I forced it even closer to like around 1.5 kilometers, which is generally quite close. So there you can just see me about to kill my velocity relative to the target, and once that was done, sort of just point towards the target and do the same sort of lazy method of docking. So yeah, here you can see me just approaching the craft, and again, killing velocity relative to the craft, targeting the docking port, just facing towards it, and again, I sort of had to transfer a Kerbal to the interplanetary stage so that I could have somebody controlling it. And I believe I took Jeb again, just because he's a pilot, sort of easier. I don't think it really mattered. But yeah, you can just see me targeting the two craft and sort of powering towards the lander with the nuclear engines. I don't know. I think I forgot to actually point towards the other one once I finished transferring Jebediah. But now you can see me just detaching that lander, sort of just throwing it behind me. I think that will just be left as space junk in an orbit there. So here you can see me just ejecting from Ike a little bit, and I sort of wanted to put myself into an orbit that's below Ike's orbital height, but then also sort of above low Duna orbit, sort of in a middle point there, so that it's not a really long time, so that I can get a long orbital period, so that I can get a very accurate sort of return to Kerbin, but then also not intersecting with Ike. So here you can see me just about to execute that burn that will take me down to Kerbin's height. And then from there, it's just a quick adjustment for me to get a Kerbin encounter. And I didn't really bother considering G-force tolerance on the Kerbals. I sort of just rammed that pod directly into Kerbin's atmosphere. And, you know, Kerbals are pretty hardy creatures. They can sort of survive. And so here you can see me just doing that mid-course correction burn. And yeah, there it is. So now I should be intersecting Kerbin's surface, or atmosphere at the very least. And I realized that I'm now going to be entering on the dark side of Kerbin, which is kind of garbage, so I quickly just reversed that with a quick little puff of the nuclear engines. So now you can see me sort of getting close to the atmosphere. I tried to detach the interplanetary stage pretty late so that I could get some relatively nice fireworks, as you can see. Those are, yeah, and after that it was pretty simple. The parachutes just deployed, and then I jettisoned the heat shield once they deployed fully, and from that, it's pretty standard, just time warp down to the surface, and with that, that's pretty much the challenge done.